Greetings, class. This is the week that we're turning in our book review rough drafts, and so I wanted to review a couple things and then also cover a couple other points that will hopefully help you in this process. So, once again, your book review is going to have four parts: the introduction, the summary, critical evaluation, and the conclusion. For your introduction, please make sure to include something about the basics of the book and the author and why he's qualified to write this book. Make sure those elements are in there, and then do whatever you'd like to do to introduce the review that you're going to be providing. In the summary, make sure again that you don't go chapter by chapter in presenting your summary. You need to do some synthesizing, thinking across lines, which is why I emphasized in a previous video the idea of looking for his thesis, looking for his purpose, and relating the ideas of various chapters to those things, which will help you provide a better review. Because honestly, anyone could go online almost with Amazon and look at the table of contents, figure out what the chapters are about, and even possibly skim some of that. So your review's got to do a little bit more work than just telling us what's in this chapter, then this chapter, then this chapter. You need to build some bridges there. Again, you're not critiquing at that point, but you are helping to cross some boundaries as someone who's read the book and helping someone like myself, perhaps, who hasn't read the book, and I'm deciding whether I want to read this book or not. Then your critical evaluation section. Again, this is the part that sets this assignment in a different category from book reports, from reflection papers, because at this point now you're going to be interacting with and giving evaluation, critique on certain aspects of the book. This can be positive or negative, constructive if you want to look at it that way. But this is what's going to set it apart from those other kinds of assignments you may have done in other settings. So again, probably the simplest way to do this would be to go through your notes that you've taken, go through the book, and find 3 or 4 elements that you really want to connect with. I would hope that at least 1 or 2 of those relate directly to the purpose and the main point of the book, but all of them don't have to be that. Some of them can be on a smaller scale. And again, remember, once you start evaluating, you probably will have to provide some more details, but the critical evaluation is not just summarizing in more detail. You're making a specific point that you're going to back up with evidence to support your point, your opinion, your conclusion about a certain dimension of the book. So again, if we say William Zinsser is an excellent illustrator, I would expect that you're going to give me some examples of how Zinsser illustrates his points in the book that will back up your point and your evaluation of that. Or if we say, perhaps, William Zinsser could have done a much better job relating this subject to other books in the field. Well, I would hope that you give me some examples of other books that would have been very natural for William Zinsser to have known and have integrated into this book to better help his readers. So again, make an assertion and then back it up with evidence, and do that for about 3 or 4 paragraphs, 3 or 4 different items in the book, and that's your critical evaluation. Then lastly, your conclusion. Go ahead and bring together some of those ideas that you've already covered, and then I usually encourage people at the end of the conclusion, broaden it out, connect this to some other area of life, some other area of work or ministry or whatever it might be, whoever you perceive your audience might be in reading this review. So those are the 4 sections of the book review. Now, a couple personal notes here before I get on to these issues with editing. First, I mentioned in the last video the idea of looking for the author's thesis and understanding his purpose. Now, we have to recognize some books are more thesis-driven, and some books are more purpose-driven. What do I mean by that? Well, a thesis-driven book is one that's making a specific point, and every element of that book is really rigorously working to back up that assertion, that main point that the author's making. We tend to think of these as more academic books. A purpose-driven book, on the other hand, is something where the author desires to accomplish something and the various elements are going to working towards that purpose, but the purpose may not necessarily be a specific point. It may not be an intellectual argument of that nature. For example, if we took a book on the Christian life, and the main purpose of the author is to produce more faithful evangelists as a result of this book. Now, he's going to make all kinds of different biblical arguments in there, but really, in the end, his goal is to motivate and to better equip people. He's got a real purpose driving this book, as opposed to someone in a more academic setting writing about the process of sharing the gospel and how it is that a person goes from here to there in hearing about and then understanding and believing the gospel. And then they would be backing up their theory of how that happens with evidence from social studies and from the Bible. So that's going to be more of a thesis-driven book, whereas the one I mentioned before is going to be more purpose-driven. So you're going to have to decide where Zinsser falls in that spectrum, and just keep that in mind, that that's different books function in different ways. So don't feel bad if you're feeling like it's tipping one way or the other, and you're tending to emphasize purpose or thesis more than the other. Go ahead and make that analysis on your own, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it's not just either or both and. It tends to be, where does the book fall on this kind of a spectrum? Then lastly, as a personal note, you're going to have your own style in writing this book. I've heard Mrs. Kreider say that she likes to write as she goes, and that may be perfectly good for you. And you may be someone who, as you're reading, you write little paragraphs, you write sentences here and there, and then a lot of that works together, and you kind of cobble together a really rough draft that then you work into a rough draft that you're going to hand in. And if that works for you, fantastic. Personally, for myself, I'm more of a linear note-taker kind of person. I like to work through the various elements of the book. I'm writing things, definitely. I'm writing thoughts that I have from the book, but it all tends to be in more of a strict outline format about the book, and then I go back and I work through it again, and then I start with a blank document, and I start putting things where I think they should go and have to do a lot of the writing afterwards. So whatever works for you, you may want to try both of them as part of this class, because we've also got a research paper coming up. But recognize you've got to get to know yourself as a writer and what works for you. And it's good to listen to and learn from what other people do, because, again, we can all learn from and benefit from each other's styles and approaches. Now, a couple notes on editing. This is going to both help you for your rough draft, but also once you get your rough draft back, and then you're looking to turn into a final draft, you're going to apply these things to both times that you hand in this paper, and then especially to your research paper coming up. I like to think of editing in a couple different ways, and for me personally, again, it's helpful to approach my document and have in mind, what kind of editing am I doing right now? And so I've come up with these categories that help me think through that. Again, if we can think of it in terms of macro editing, content editing, and micro level editing. What do I mean by macro level editing? This is stepping back and looking at the paper as a whole. How do the various parts fit together? Are the various parts what I want to be there? One approach that I like to do with this is called back outlining. This is going to be more helpful for your research paper, but it might help you with the book review too. Take a blank piece of paper out once you're all done with your draft, and for each paragraph, write down one sentence, just one sentence, and summarize what that paragraph is, what it's doing, something like that. And once you get to the end, go ahead and look over those sentences and see if it makes sense the way it flows. See if you need to move some things in the order. For example, in your critical evaluation, you may end up having two positive thoughts, a negative thought, and then another positive thought. And you may think, you know what, I think it would make more sense if I bumped my negative critique higher up on the list. You would only notice that probably if you had stepped back and done some more macro level type of editing and reviewing of your paper. Also, at this point, it's good to look at your transitions and how those big building blocks of the paper are tied together, or if they're not, that they need to be tied together, and you can go back and do that. When I'm talking about content editing, you could say, okay, I've got the paper generally how I want it in terms of its order and structure, but this is where you go through and actually look at the meat of each paragraph. Is this paragraph doing what I want it to do? Is it necessary for me to have this quote in here, or could I accomplish what I want to do in this paragraph without this quote? And you could add things, you can remove things. Doing that might make you recall something else that was in your notes that you didn't get put in there, but you're specifically looking at what's in there and should it be there, and that sort of thing. And then finally, at the micro level, that's where you're going through and you're doing your basic grammar check, you're doing your spell check, you're making sure your punctuation is being used properly. That lower level, you want to save that towards the end of your editing process, because if you make lots of changes in the first two approaches, you'll end up messing up all your grammar and punctuation anyways, and you have to go back and do that again. So if that's helpful for you, that's, you could do multiple read-throughs of your paper, the first time focusing on the big picture, the second time focusing on the meat of each little section, and then finally giving it one last read-through to make sure that everything's neat and clean. And so that may be one way to approach editing that you can do for this rough draft, for your final draft, and especially then for your research paper. We're happy to answer questions about this and help you along the way in this process. And again, we look forward to looking at your reviews coming in here and giving you constructive feedback.